Unfortunately, Joy and Tim both have had to send their apologies because they're not feeling very well, so we wish them both a speedy recovery. A few announcements before we start. I think most of you will know the format, but for anyone who's joining for the first time, the way we usually spend the evening is we have about 45 minutes for the talk. Then we'll have a very brief pause and then an opportunity for questions. So we have a good period of time, up to about 40 minutes for questions. If you do have a question, then please do wave your hand and someone will come to you with the microphone. Do wait for them to arrive before you speak so we can all hear you, as well as the people online as well. And as I was saying, that will bring us to finish promptly at 9 o'clock or shortly before, for those of you who need to get home or catch trains or public transport. So it's now my pleasure to welcome our speaker this evening, who is Dr. Bethany Sollereder, who is Research Fellow in Science and Religion at the Laudato Si Research Institute at Campion Hall in Oxford. She has interests in theology of evolution, the problem of suffering, and also climate change, which is the topic she's going to be speaking on this evening. The title of her talk is Climate Change is Here, Now What? So we look forward to hearing from you, Bethany, and all that you have to say this evening.
It's a real pleasure to be here, and how wonderful is it to be in person, to see smiling faces in the audience, and what a grand place. I love this church, so thank you for having me here in person. Well, the world is changing rapidly, as it turns out. So since the 1980s, scientists have warned that our use of fossil fuels was putting us at risk of changing the climate. The IPCC report that was released just last week has confirmed that those fears were not unfounded. We have changed the climate by about 1 degree Celsius, and further change is now irretrievably locked in. Kind of sounds grim, doesn't it? But what happens if we back up a little bit? That the climate is changing is actually not really news in one sense. Any geologist could tell you that the climate has changed many, many times. Now, here's going to be the moment of truth. Aha, here we go. So this graph shows the average Earth temperature over the last 540 million years, roughly the time span over which complex life has been on Earth. The dotted line through the middle is not where we are today, nor is it the average. It actually shows the point. Above that temperature, there are no glaciers or polar ice caps on Earth. Below it is temperatures at which the Earth does have those things. So the blue gold star on the bottom right-hand side shows the current average temperature at just above 14 degrees Celsius, and the red star above that line indicates where scientists think post-anthropogenic warming will stop. Now, what struck me immediately when I saw this is that over this longer time period that we're looking at, the Earth is actually estimated to have spent much more time without polar ice caps, for example, than with them. So massive amounts of climate change are actually part of the natural course of things for this planet. From our perspective, in this perspective, we're in an actually reasonably cold period, a rare icehouse world, and both extremely hot periods like the late Permian, the peak that you see in the middle, and extremely cold periods like the KT impact winter that resulted in the mass extinction of the dinosaurs. Scientists estimate that 99% of all species that have ever lived have already gone extinct. So extinction is not a new thing. And for the last 11,000 years, however, we have had a relatively stable temperature globally. And this period is known as the Holocene. I think I'm pushing the wrong button, which is not helping. There we go. So this, you can see the Holocene here with the purple arrow kind of showing that Holocene average. So the Holocene is just that little tiny bit at the end of the graph where you see it kind of stopping, going up and down, just that little brief period we have there. And the red arrow further down is showing the average temperature over the last 500,000 years or so. So the important thing about where that purple arrow is, the Holocene, is that it's during this period that humans have significantly reshaped the Earth through agriculture and domestication. So while behaviorally modern humans have been around for about 50,000 years, and anatomically modern humans for about 200,000 years, so about the middle of that graph. It's during this Holocene's stable temperatures that our ability to expand our population due to reliable food and scalable food sources has really blossomed and bloomed. We've suddenly got 8 billion people. So when scientists with the IPCC talk about pre-industrial levels, they're not talking about any of these graphs I've shown you. They're simply talking about that last little bit, that sweet spot of the Holocene that has sustained the expansion of the human population for which our infrastructure is particularly built. So in this talk, I'm going to explore what it means theologically if we're leaving the Holocene behind and we're facing a new normal of ever-rising temperatures. Now, in an earlier version of this talk, I enumerated all the dreadful things that will happen: the drought, the famine, extinction, war, refugees, etc. But you probably already know those things, and I might get into a little bit later, but I won't do that. So let's start with a point of light. No matter how badly Earth temperatures rise in the coming centuries, we're not talking about the end of life on Earth. Very simply, this is because the vast majority of life is not actually human, nor even animal. So by weight, there's 35 times more bacteria than there is of all animal life combined, for example. Humans and mammals compose just 0.067 gigatons by carbon weight, or 0.25% of the 550 gigatons of carbon life on Earth. As Bill Bryson once noted, bacteria may not build cities or have interesting social lives, but they will be here when the sun explodes. This is their planet, and we are on it only because they allow us to be here. He could have said the same about archaea or protists or various other types of life, but we have been trained to think of humans, think of ourselves as the pinnacle of creation, the end point of all previous species. And theologically speaking, I think this is in particular because of two doctrines, right? First, humans are made in the image of God uniquely, and second, because of the incarnation, that God took on human flesh and dwelt among us, seems to give us an exalted, a necessary, necessarily exalted place amongst creaturely life. Yet increasingly, scholarship is actually beginning to question how necessarily anthropocentric, or even better, there's a word, anthropomonist. Has anybody heard that? No? So anthropomonist is this idea that only humans matter. So you could be anthropocentric, say humans have a very special place, but anthropomonic is everything else is arranged around humans. So scholars have questioned how necessarily anthropomonic even those two doctrines really are. So our question is, do the image of God and the incarnation indicate theologically that only humans are of value to God's creative purposes? So if humans go extinct, is God's story of creation over? Well, the work of Ruth Page, Dennis Edwards, Jürgen Moltmann, Holmes Rolston, Elizabeth Johnson, Niels Gregerson, and many others would say no. Well, most of these authors, Ruth Page might be an exception, would defend that humans have a uniquely important place in theological history. They have been working on the theological importance of animals and the non-human creation more widely to God. And so one example of this is the idea of deep incarnation. And this is a term that was coined by Neil Scragerson. We'll get there eventually. There we go. So deep incarnation is an attempt to expand the boundaries of where we see the importance of the identification of the particular life of Jesus of Nazareth to the wider world. So when Christ, the second person of the Trinity, became incarnate in Jesus of Nazareth, we don't see that as only of significance to the Jews, only of significance to men, only of significance to carpenters, right? We already say in God becoming human, all humans are represented by Christ. Humanity as a whole is ennobled by that act of God. So deep incarnation asks, well, why stop there? The Gospel of John does not say that God became human and dwelt among us, but God became sarx, God became flesh. Traditionally, we've tended to only bother to spell out what it means that God became human flesh, that there is neither Jew nor Gentile, slave nor free, male nor female, but all are one in Christ Jesus. And everyone said, amen? Yeah, there we go. We'll get there. I've got Pentecostal in me. I'm sorry. I like some talking back. We'll get there. So, what we have not done is fully articulate what it means that God became flesh. God became mammal. God became chordate. God became animal. Or if you really want to stretch it, God became molecules of carbon, oxygen, hydrogen, etc. And so deep incarnation allows us to see the unity that the incarnation offers not only to all humans, regardless of race or gender, but also to all life, and even possibly to all matter. So what might that mean for extreme climate change? It could mean that even if all humans and most animals go extinct, which is rather unlikely, we'll come back to that, but that the providential purposes of God can be remade and redeemed. The implications of salvation offered through the incarnation are not limited to the human species. So who is to say that God will not start a new phase of salvation history through the future descendant of the octopus or of the remarkably intelligent slime mold? Who knows? Now, I don't necessarily think that there would be another incarnation, which some people have speculated about, because with the thinking of deep incarnation, God has already inhabited shared flesh with the cephalopod and the slime mold. So just as God didn't need to become incarnate in every race or culture, but came once for all, then God doesn't need to become incarnate in every species, but came once for all. Some people disagree with me on that. But perhaps God would be made known to those future species in a similar way to how God showed up in the Hebrew Bible, or indeed as the Holy Spirit makes Christ present today. So the incarnation does not necessarily require us to have an anthropomorphic view of the centrality of humans. God's creative interaction with the world would continue in a radically changed world. So if the doctrine of incarnation allows us to think outside the sort of humans-only box, what can we say about the image of God? If we looked at the diverse interpretations of the image of God, now I'm a little embarrassed about this next slide because it's the wrong cathedral, and I do apologize for that. You just don't have a good reflecting pool in yours. I checked today, it's not there. So Salisbury it is. I apologize. So if we looked at the diverse interpretations of the image of God, we would struggle to find any kind of united definition. Indeed, looking over the whole span of interpretations, I'm tempted to agree with Hendrikus Berkhoff's wry observation that, quote, by studying how systematic theologies have poured meaning into Genesis 1:26, one could write a piece of Europe's cultural history, end quote. So exegetes seem to have basically taken whatever supposedly essential attribute they liked best about themselves and decided that that is what it means to be made in the image of God. Rationality, morality, dominion, sensitivity to God, creativity, humor, and so on have all been proposed as what makes us truly human. Recent scholarship, however, has moved away from the search for that sort of singular and essential quality. Instead, scholars have focused on relational or Christological interpretations of the Imago Dei. And these point either to the unique relationship that God has chosen to have with humans, or to the idea that Christ is actually the only one who is fully made in the image of God. The rest of us are made in the image of God insofar as we're conformed to Christ's likeness. So both of these interpretations do not suggest any reason for why the image of God needs to stop at the boundary marker of the human species. Take the relational view. Just as God elected to have a particular relationship with humans, why couldn't God elect any other species or call any other species in the future? So as Joshua Moritz has pointed out, he uses this election model that we're in the image of God in the same way that Israel was elected amongst the nations. And he says God's choice of Israel was specifically because there was nothing at all special about them amongst the nations. They were not the most powerful, they were not the most numerous, they were not the most skilled. There's a slightly arbitrary nature about their election. They were called because they were loved by God. So too, other species might be called in the future simply because God loves them and chooses them. Now think of the Christological interpretation. We are all in the image of God insofar as we're conformed to Christ. So there's again no necessary need to stop at the human species, insofar as the giant squid or its descendants could be conformed to the likeness of Christ with millions more years of evolution. They too could be considered to be made in the image of God if God so chose, especially with, many more millions of years to evolve. So the story of God's creation did not begin with humans, and there's no necessary reason to believe that it will end with humans either, nor necessarily be limited to this planet. There's a whole bunch of people who do sort of astrotheology, which is quite interesting. David Wilkinson at Durham, Andrew Davison at Cambridge. So I have them sort of in my mind as well. So creation, far from being a static description of something that happened in the prehistoric past, it describes God's ongoing work with the world. God is creating every day new possibilities, new relationships, new redemptions. And I just don't think that we with our fossil fuels are actually powerful enough to put an end to that. I just don't think we can do it. Now, by the way, I'm not arguing that I think all humans will go extinct. The last time the Earth was as warm as it's likely to be, mammals actually thrived and began to fill the Earth. However, the pace of change is rather dramatic, and we're quite likely to diminish our number significantly. But even that does not mean that the story of God's work is over. So I've started with reflections on sort of a worst-case scenario in the long-distant future of sort of dramatic ecological collapse. But what about the short term? If we can be persuaded that the long-term purposes of God cannot be thwarted by our failure, how should we think about the next few decades? Now, the effects of climate change on human economics and on our world will be profound. There will be significant reductions in yield for maize, wheat, soy, and rice for each degree Celsius increase in global mean temperature. And that's a problem because these are the key crops that not only we rely on, but our livestock rely on. Fisheries are at risk. We have food supply issues that are already widespread. And many of them have gotten worse with this war over the last few weeks. We have severe reductions in food production that are compounded by the risk of increased inequality of distribution that will mean that malnutrition and starvation will increase. And add to this, heat waves, fires, the expanded geographical reach of disease-bearing insects, a lack of water for many cities that rely on glacier runoffs. There's quite a disaster in the making, and this is not in the far future. We're seeing these changes already, and we could be looking at really significant changes by 2050. And that's not even accounting for war, which has already broken out, may break out even more as we go forward. So I've got some slides. You actually won't be able to read them because they're too small, but they're from the IPCC talking about the sort of differences that will happen between warming of 1.5 degrees, 2 degrees, and 3 degrees. And so there's just kind of talking about the differences. So you can look this up online. It's all set up there. Now, there's almost no chance that we're going to keep warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. So when people ask me, well, what should we do about climate change? What is the one thing? I'm increasingly saying, learn to welcome migrants. It's not a moral failure to be made desperate by climate change. It's not a moral failure to seek the possibility of stable food supplies. And many parts of the world that are heavily inhabited at this point soon will not be life-supporting, and people are going to move. So let's see them as the people they are, as our brothers and sisters looking for the basics of life. If you take one thing from this talk, let it be this: let us embrace migration, because it's not going away and it's not going to get better. As a side note, I've really been encouraged by the groundswell of welcome for Ukrainian refugees. So I mean, suddenly the arguments that we don't have room here or we just can't afford refugees have just evaporated, and I've been so encouraged by that. But if we can just see that the climate refugees are equally innocent victims of circumstances that they did not create, perhaps we can find a similar spirit of hospitality. Now that actually, I think, is the main point of sort of spiritual preparation we can do with climate change. Those of us who have enough, more than enough, need to share with those who do not. Now, I could spend all the rest of the time we have together just kind of saying this over and over in different ways, because I think it's actually that important, but I'm not going to do that. So what I'll discuss with the rest of our time is some of the more technological or scientific options that are open to us and evaluate them theologically. So scientifically speaking, if we're past the climate tipping point and mere restriction of carbon emissions will not stop further change, there are really two possible routes ahead of us, right? So we can attempt drastic interventions that try and reverse these changes, stop and reverse them, usually through technology. Or we can try to adapt to a world whose changes in temperatures will not likely stop at even 3 degrees. Now, either one of these choices has underpinning theological considerations and implications. So first, we might try to reverse global warming through the use of radical technologies. So there are some really drastic interventions that have been proposed, like releasing aerosols in the high atmosphere to reflect the sun's incoming heat, or we could fertilize the oceans to encourage carbon dioxide hungry algae blooms to sort of eat up the CO2. But these interventions presuppose a particularly strong sense of our human species' control over the biosphere. Now, it is undoubtedly the case that humans have changed every ecosystem on Earth, but much of this was done without the knowledge that we could actually affect the very fabric of global ecosystems. But if we try this, if we try and geoengineer the Earth through an intentional planet-wide intervention, we would be taking a role in planetary history that is intentionally, self-consciously, one of dominion and control. We could no longer pretend to be simple stewards of creation, nor could we act as if we're simply one part of the wider community of creation. After all, remember, climate change is a natural occurrence, and other species have actually caused climate change before by emitting toxic gases. The first time it happened was 2.4 billion years ago, when cyanobacteria nearly destroyed life and caused drastic climate change. So this has happened before. But ever since Lynn White Jr., this is the paper, that his landmark 1967 paper, in which he blamed Christian models of dominion for the environmental crisis, ever since he published that, theologians have been sort of falling over themselves to emphasize the sort of participatory and non-coercive nature of the human role. So John Zizoulis, T.F. Torrance, John Chryssavgis emphasize that the human relationship to nature is one of priesthood, of self-sacrificial service and mediation of praise, rather than control or dominion. Richard Bauckham insists that we must think of ourselves as a part of the community of creation, but not standing above it, not its master. Anne Primavesi even calls stewardship exploitative and unecological, while Claire Palmer condemns it as unbiblical. So this idea that humans should exercise control over the natural world is theologically deeply unpopular. Paradoxically, if we take up the task of stopping the snowballing climate before it becomes an avalanche, or if we take drastic action to alter the course of that avalanche, we would have to be honest that we are standing over and above the course of all other life. Now, somebody like Rosemary Radford Ruther accepts that. She says, quote, "Like it or not, if the diverse biota of the earth are to be protected and preserved, it will only be by the human community asserting an enlightened guardianship over it," end quote. So whether the human community is capable of sustained enlightened guardianship is a whole nother question, over which a few pretty big red flags should probably be waved. But now I can just hear you, I can see you, I've got some squinted eyes looking at me skeptically saying, but intervening at this point is only cleaning up what we have messed up. So it's actually different. You're off on the wrong foot, Bethany. Okay, maybe, but arguably our intervention at this point might be worse. The first people who started to dig up coal in industrial amounts didn't have the faintest clue that they could change the composition of the Earth's atmosphere or acidify the seemingly boundless oceans. But if we do this, we would be striking out to cause a change at a global level without knowing whether or not it will work, or if it will only make things worse, which some of the modeling suggests. So if, however, we decide, okay, that's a little too much, we should maybe adapt to the changes, perhaps mitigate the worst case scenarios of widespread extinction to slow our emission of carbon, but largely to avoid radical steps to ensure the stable climate, then we would have to have some other really frank discussions. First, we'd have to talk about the way we think about ecological restoration. So traditionally, I'm going to say we have restored backwards. And what I mean by that is that we would start with a compromised, a hybrid I'm sorry, those should have been in white at the bottom rather than black. That was my bad. So we start with something that's changed from its historical ecosystem into a hybrid form. And we tend to try and find some past historical benchmark and then restore to that. So we're restoring back to something that we remember from earlier. Now, however, if the world is changing, we need to start thinking about how to restore forward. So as the climate changes, the historical benchmarks will no longer provide a suitable basis for restoration. So with caution, with wisdom, with all the foresight we can muster, we might need to help species to migrate, to create novel ecosystems that do not reflect the past, that do not replicate the past, but which take advantage of new opportunities. So it may mean, imagine a particular food source in an ecosystem, say you've got a bush that produces a lot of berries, is going extinct in an area due to drought. We might think of introducing a similar species from a drier area, say import a bunch of Spanish berry species into Britain, so that the wild food source stays intact. And so instead of focusing on species composition, we begin to worry more about ecosystem function. Of course, that also presumes a certain proprietorship over the earth and the ecosystems. Another thing with the changes that are coming, we need to have some frank discussions about suffering, death, and the diminishment of our own species. With these changes will come an immense amount of suffering. We need to be theologically prepared to encounter that. And if creation is not uniquely about human existence, as I argued in the first half, then perhaps we should be willing to embrace a diminishment of our own species from 8 billion to a much smaller number. We might end up taking the position of John the Baptist toward Jesus. He must increase, but I must decrease. Other life must increase, but we must decrease. And it's been interesting mulling over these thoughts during the last 2 years of pandemic. So the UK passed 160,000 COVID-related deaths. And I want to very carefully articulate the loss that this has been to so many, including myself, the many tragedies involved in these last 2 years, and the heroism of the NHS and other care workers who have really sacrificed to give the best possible care to those who are sick. It's been remarkable. Yet my own view of death is also shaped by my father's career as a GP. He always maintained that he never once in his entire career saved a life. He'd say, I've extended a few. You might say I shortened a few accidentally, but hopefully he extended more. But despite all our effort, the birth to death rate remains 1 to 1. And there's a resistance in the Western world to acknowledge the obvious, that every human life ends in death, and that's the proper end of a human life. Now, if that sounds odd to you theologically, it might be helpful to know that I'm amongst the number of theologians that insist that spiritual death was a result of sin, but that physical death was not a result of sin, but an integral part of creation from the first. And so you join someone like St. Francis of Assisi, who says, "Praise be to you, my Lord, for sister death, from whom no one living can escape." In the Western world, we've actually become so good at medically controlling physical life, at prolonging it, that we sometimes have the illusion that we can escape our sister death. And so we extend life and extend life and extend life. And then what I seem to be seeing happening is that when we can no longer control the extension of life, by and large, then we want to control how it ends, with burgeoning pressure to legalize physician-assisted suicide in the many countries that have not yet already legalized it. So there's a failure to acknowledge that we are creatures, that we are not masters of the earth, nor even of our own lives. We are creatures supported by the earth, but dust we are, and to dust we shall return. And I think that there's an interesting parallel between how we see climate change and how we see personal death. And it comes to this matter of control, of what is the appropriate control to put over these different spheres of life. What do I mean? So let's go back to one of the slides we saw at the beginning. And it shows the changes. Sorry, I keep hitting the wrong button here. I think I've turned it off. Okay, anyways, it was the slide that had, there we go, haha. So this is showing the changes in temperature over the last 500,000 years. Now these changes are associated with the Earth's orbital patterns. That's why it's going down for a long area, it's jumping up into an interglacial period, and then it's going down again. And we've seen this pattern for about 2 million years. And we're in that little interglacial period. So if humans had not burned any fossil fuels, those patterns would have brought us into another ice age in about 1,500 years. So Canada, northern United States, the UK, much of northern Europe would eventually be crushed under glaciers, as permanent a dislocation of place as the island nations now face, disappearing under the waves. To protect both those environments, the UK and the island nations, we would require keeping the climate on the knife edge that it is now in, this Holocene sweet spot. A knife edge that, as we've seen, is neither a regular stopping point for the climate nor any kind of planetary norm. So let's imagine humans managed to coordinate their activities and technology in such a way that we could actually achieve that. This would not only be the most significant act of dominion and domination over the planet that has ever happened, but it would also be to prioritize one particular climate and one slice of biodiversity over all others if we just stopped the next ice age from happening by burning more fossil fuels. And this is where the question of sort of anthropology and the human role becomes so interesting. So if instead of being in the place of a rising climate, if we were in the place where the climate was naturally getting colder, and we could look forward to all the loss of habitat, the widespread extinctions, and the disruption to economies and agriculture that would involve, would it be the human task to stop that? If you were the leader of the world, do you think it would be right to stop the next ice age? So I'm going to do yes, no, and then I don't know. So put your hand up if you say yes, it would be right to stop the next ice age if we could have done it. Okay, a few. How about no? We definitely should not. Okay, and then I don't know. Okay, so we're divided. And it's a really interesting question. And as we bring it to reflect on our current moment, insofar as we try to prevent climate change, should we try and stop just this particular instance of climate change or all the regular tides of climate change? How much management of wild ecosystems can happen before they just become really big zoos? We actually thrive on controlling the world. We desire control, and that's natural. But my caution is that in trying to limit the damage we've done to the world, that we make sure we don't try to control the life right out of it. That's my intuition anyways, and it's very possible I'm deeply wrong about that. But we could, in that same instance, just as I'm saying, well, maybe we shouldn't try and control climate change, we could say, actually, we could try a different line. We could say that keeping this knife-edge climate is precisely the human job. Perhaps we're co-creators with God, and an artificially stable climate for the benefit of so many creatures is part of our calling. So someone like Philip Hefner has used this phrase of created co-creators, and it's been picked up in the work of Ted Peters and others to suggest that we should not merely steward the natural course of things. That if we're heading into another ice age, we should try and prevent it. That humans are right to use their creativity and their unprecedented power to create a new state of things that combines human ingenuity and divine creativity. So you could look at the broad scope of the Bible as an example. God begins by making a garden for people to live in. When they get kicked out of that, Cain starts a city. So cities are not part of God's creative remit, but are the work of human hands. And yet in the final eschatological image of the book of Revelation, the heavenly Jerusalem is described as a garden city. It's a melding of these two types of dwelling place, the creativity and of human creativity combined. So if the stable temperatures of the Holocene would normally have changed in 1,000, 1,500 years, they still would have changed. But perhaps finding ways to maintain this temperature for far longer is the global equivalent to sort of city building. It's a global example of niche construction. And maybe, as someone like Christopher Southgate has suggested, that the human task could be to eliminate the existence of extinction altogether, human and non-human, but that could only be achieved through absolute mastery of the Earth's conditions. Two different paths. So we could argue that. I'm not going to. I don't think total mastery over the Earth is our destiny. Radical technological attempts to try to stop climate change may themselves actually have radical and unintended consequences. And perhaps preventing extinction would in fact prevent the development of future species, robbing Earth's history of potential richness that will come out of our simple reluctance to change. And so I just wonder, if we're not wise enough to understand all the consequences of our actions, are we wise enough to try and keep a stable climate in the way that some people have suggested? Well, whatever we choose, the consequences will be far-reaching and they will be globally felt. And very few of those who will literally suffer the consequences will have any part in the decision-making process. So I've talked throughout this lecture about a whole bunch of things, and I realize I've just poured a whole bunch of theological ideas on you, and you've been very, very patient. So I've talked from reinterpretations of the image of God and the doctrine of the incarnation. I spoke about two different ways that our attempts to control could either help or hinder our adaptation to the coming changes. We talked about ecological restoration into novel systems and questions around life and the end of life areas. But as we close, as befits a lecture on a topic where there's actually so much uncertainty, even towards what theological models we should be using in this unprecedented moment we're in, there are plenty of loose ends and plenty of issues for us to discuss later. So that is just a few of the other issues that I didn't raise. But what we do know is climate change is here, and how we choose to respond will have repercussions that will echo for many ages to come, not only for human history, but for all of animal and indeed creaturely history. So the future is here. Which way are you choosing? Thank you.